Hello everyone, welcome. I'm Mariana Almeida and this is the McKinsey Talks directly from the McKinsey studio in São Paulo. This is our new Customer-centric growth series. We'll talk to some of the world's most influential chief product officers about the challenges and the joys of their role and go deeper into what makes a successful product-led organization, their role, their relationship with peers, the board, and explore topics such as talent, operating model, and much more. Product-led and customer-centric organizations are the winners of hyper-growth. They are a new breed of organization that puts product at the center of everything they do. The CPO or the VP of Product is in the center of it all. This series will be led by Fabrício Dor, partner at McKinsey and leader of product, design, and customer experience in Latin America. Welcome, Fabrício.
Thank you, Mariana. Thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here discussing this topic.
And for today's conversation, we are here with Jag Duggal, CPO at Nubank, which, as you all see, is a leading product-led organization, extremely customer-centric, as Fabrício would put. Hello, Jag. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Pleasure to be with both of you. Really excited for the conversation and excited to see where it'll take us.
Super fantastic, Jag. Thanks again. And to kickstart our conversation here today, just have an opening question, which is, what's your favorite product in the world? And why?
Having spent 15, almost 20 years in tech and in broadly defined Silicon Valley, I'll give you a perhaps unusual answer. One of the products that I most love, that I think really captures the thinking in the zeitgeist, is not at all digital. It is my Vitamix, which I use every morning to make a smoothie for my wife and I. And the reason I think it's such a great example of what great products are is that the Vitamix has redefined the category previously known as blender. Mm-hmm. And a blender has been around for forever. It has had the same problems forever. Stuff that you try to blend doesn't blend very easily. Mm-hmm. It is hard to clean, and I could go on and on. Vitamix, and I am not at all an expert on this product, but Vitamix, at its most simple, putting a motor into the blender that is, I don't know exactly the technical specs, but let's say 10 times as powerful as a traditional motor in a blender, removes a lot of the problems you have in making a smoothie, making a mixed drink, making a soup, making whatever it might be. And it has transformed my behavior. I now make a smoothie with complete regularity, 6 to 7 days a week. It has built a new habit. It has redefined my behavior as a consumer. It has redefined the category. I could give you some other examples. Tesla is an obvious one. Tesla did not simply redefine and introduce a new category of an electric car. But what really impressed me about what Elon Musk and the team have done is they went beyond that. That was a massive mission to take on Detroit and Stuttgart and Tokyo and all of the big powers in the auto industry, some of the largest companies in the world. They built an electric car. On top of that, but they didn't stop there. On top of that, they have built a car for the age we live in, where we are all connected to devices and you can, have all of your electronic life with you on the move. And then beyond that, they also took on a third challenge of a self-driving car. The sheer ambition and the willingness to understand that there were actually three vectors upon which you could redefine redefine mobility. I think the ambition of that is worthy of a company that's now valued at $1 trillion, and 24 months ago was 1/10 of that. I think it's really an impressive story.
No, they're both very great cases, and I think they touch very different from each other, but I think they touch something that it's in the core of great products and great experience, which is behavior change, right? The changing your behavior, creating an habit, changing how you do something. I think the Vitamix, right? That's what it's called. It's even quite powerful for that matter, right? Because it's very personal. It changes a personal habit.
For the whole family.
Yeah, for the family, and possibly making you do like experimentations, things you wouldn't do otherwise, right? So I think that's a great example. Thanks for sharing. And I think you started going a little bit into that direction. I want to go deeper into your background and your career, right? Because I think people see the others where they are, and you are an incredible, one of the most important product roles in the world at this point. But what's your background? Like where it comes from? Because I know you've been through technology companies, but what made you go into product, for example? Like what's your background?
Yeah, there's two levels at which I could answer that question. One is what I lived through, and the other is looking back with some perspective. First, the first version of it is when I was in consulting. I had my office mate Fabrizio. You may resonate with this, and he had moved out to Silicon Valley, and company where he was actually the head of product had been acquired by Google at the time in 2005, early 2006. This was still a relatively small acquisition, hundreds of millions of dollars, but it was the largest acquisition Google had made at that point. And he and the founders had decided that they were moving on and they needed someone to run this business, which became called Google Audio Ads. I had just left consulting. I was in graduate school, and he said, come out for the summer. And then once I got there, he said, we're leaving. We need someone to run this business. Google was, the most exciting company in the world at that point. And I dropped out of 2 graduate schools, moved from the East Coast of the US to the West Coast. And they asked me what job I would go into. I had never heard of product at the time. Mm-hmm. And they basically described to me that product was the role where you worked across functions to decide, what was done. And that was probably the role that made the most sense. So I said, fine, sign me up for that. And that's what I ended up interviewing for at Google. So that's the reality of what I lived. With a little bit of perspective, my career in consulting, the firm I worked at and the time I worked there was a really interesting time. In the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, we were going through a transition. And the way the partners at the firm described it to me when I joined was in the wake of World War II and the rebuilding of the global industrial base, demand massively outstripped supply. And so a lot of what consulting and business was about was helping companies understand how they could optimize and grow supply. And the companies that won, who were good at that, were the ones that won. And the companies that were good at that were the ones that got scale economics, and the flywheel went on. Mm-hmm. And as we got towards 1990, early 1990s, the German industrial base was built up along with the rest of Europe. Japan had become a developed country. Since then, we've had countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam becoming global centers of garment manufacturing, for example. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the Chinese manufacturing miracle, what's happening in India, etc. And so we ended up, and we have been really over the last quarter century or so, coincident with the time I was, just starting my consulting career. We are in a world where supply is plentiful, mm-hmm. and where the magic in strategy is in understanding how to unlock new demand. And so as I look back on my product career, I was prepared really well in consulting, because that was the approach we took to every strategy project. We started every strategy project not talking to the executives of the company, but going out and talking to consumers and talking to customers more broadly. And so that, I think, was really what led me to stay in product once I sort of tripped into my first role at Google.
That's fantastic to hear. And I think it's also in the base, it's connected to my next question, which is, what is a product leader, right? What it entails, what it encompasses. Because I think you touched on some very important aspects which is deeply understanding people, deeply understanding large movements in society, right? And understanding why like certain things fit at certain moments and others don't. So it would be great to like hear a little bit from you, like what is a product, like what it entails, right?
Yeah, it's a great question for a discipline that is quite new in the grand scheme of things. And frankly, even as a profession, we are figuring it out. Let me start at the most basic level. Typical chief product officer will be responsible for the functions of product management, product design, often strategy and business development. Business development is in many ways product development in partnership with other companies. So that's at a most basic level. Sort of zooming out a little bit, we're all familiar with operations as a discipline, with sales as a discipline, with eng as a discipline, with marketing as a discipline. We're all generally familiar, have an intuition for what a COO does, what a CTO does, what a CMO does, what a chief revenue officer does. CPO, I think, is in many ways filling in the gaps between each of those critical functions. Product is really about two things, if I were to distill it all down. One is knitting together the work across all functions, starting outside in with the customer, and really deeply understanding the customer and understanding that there are in fact different types of customers. So that's one. And the second is the fact that the nature of the work is inherently spanning functions. It is cross-functional. So the product organization led by a CPO is the one responsible for leading across functions with a customer-first lens on the business focus and what the company does. And that leads to sort of, I think, a core change in how business is done over the last 15 or 20 years. In that era where supply was typically and in most industries constrained, and the race was to figure out how to produce more to meet surplus demand, that the core work of the company across all functions was really operational in nature. Many and most companies, particularly since the 1960s, were essentially in a predefined category in a fight for incremental market share. There were obviously exceptions, but those disruptions were rarer than they are today. Today, given how digital especially has blurred the boundaries between categories and allowed companies to cross those boundaries much more readily, we are now in a world where market share battles are less what defines success. And what defines success starts with innovation, an overused word for sure, but customer-driven innovation, which is really about how do I not win within the boundaries of a category, but how do I define or redefine a category? Vitamix is a great example. Tesla is a great example. Spotify is another great example. Google, where I used to work, is another great example. And so in this shift from winning share in a defined category to redefining the category, the need for a group of people, a function, which we call product, to really focus in on innovation, not at the margins, but at the core of what the company does. And doing that, and the way you do that successfully is to cross the functional boundaries and to do that with the customer first lens. And that's really what defines the mission, the work of a product organization, I would say.
And you said it's something very new. So why there are many companies that still don't have a CPO?
I think there are a couple of reasons for it. 20 years feels like a long time in a career in the grand scheme of corporate history. It's not. actually. And so I think it's an idea that's starting to diffuse out from California and Silicon Valley, where a lot of this started, out through other parts of the US and out across the globe. And I think in the course of going global, the role gets defined and redefined even more. I also think, companies have strong franchises and they succeed for a long time based on that franchise. And those franchises only erode gradually. Mm-hmm. And it's as they erode, you create the imperative for a different way of thinking. It is I read once a long time ago, it is very hard for an organization of any kind, company, government, military, you name it. It's very hard for any organization to traverse the journey from doing the right thing well, which is what successful companies, that's how they get successful, to going to a point where they are doing the wrong thing well, the thing that is no longer the right thing, but they're good at it. It's very hard to change from that to learning a new set of skills. And that involves going through a phase which no human being ever enjoys, which is doing the right thing poorly. And in order to start getting back to the point where you're back again in the next cycle doing the right thing well, you have to go through the cycle of doing the wrong thing well for a while, then doing the right thing poorly. And that's just, that's an inherent human phenomenon of resistance to change. And so I think it's just a natural cycle that is only forced by declining performance in most cases, or a phenomenal leader who's willing to drive, an organization, a collection of human beings through that painful cycle.
You're bringing a point that I think it's very much in the core of the discussion, which is, let me put it this way. When we look at, and we've been, studying the topic, right, of the organizations and how certain types of organizations are succeeding, right, into doing that. And obviously there's a natural bias towards this, like, new types of organizations such as Nubank, right, which is extremely customer-centric. It's a very fast-paced, changing environment, very organic, right? It's moving, it's learning, it's changing all the time. That I think there's two things. I think there's something beyond just being agile. It's more than that, right? It's about, and I think you mentioned that, like, it's about articulating the different capabilities from a customer perspective, right? And that's why it's so important to have a figure such as a CPO, and it's very interesting when we look at exactly companies like Nubank or Airbnb or Slack, or companies that have that, right? And just want to, like, hear from you, like, what are the differences, right, from traditional organizations? And I think one obvious one is, as you were saying, right, just the ability to reorganize, right, to have a flexible structure to reorganize with time, but also having a figure such as a CPO, for example, to articulate the customer needs into products and functionalities and services and experiences. What else, from your perspective, is different from these types of organizations?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you could answer it at many different levels. And there, at one level of granularity, there are 100 or 1,000 things that are different. But we don't have time for that for this podcast. So I'll try to give a more of a meta answer. When I'll tell a slight story. Mm-hmm. When I joined Google, having dropped out of an MBA program, actually, and having been in consulting for 10 years prior to that, I would tell friends that if an MBA professor walked into Google, they would explain to you the 50 reasons why this company is failing miserably. The only problem with the narrative was that the company was, massively successful and continues to this day. Google felt to me like a company, and this, goes down to Larry and Sergey and their background and how Eric Schmidt sort of cultivated it. But it felt like a company that had evolved on the Galapagos Islands, completely removed from the continent. And all of the practices were very, very different. They were just very, very different. And they weren't supposed to work according to like the MBA playbook. And someone who was able to help me sort of understand, because I struggled with it for at least a year when I first got there, was the head of strategy and what was called BizOps at Google. And she had written a book called Managing at the Edge of Chaos. And actually a former McKinsey partner. And I think she had written that book, as I recall, shortly before she joined Google. And I think that's the biggest difference. A traditional company, and there's long history going through Drucker and all of the sort of great business writers, that there's a lot of heritage that comes from, military analogies about how companies are run. More recent, arguably modern, technology-driven, customer-centric companies, they are difficult to work in because every day feels like you're managing at the edge of chaos. In many ways, the Drucker of our age is Jeff Bezos, who is probably more articulate at codifying some of the differences. And some of these rules that he talks about, like a 2-pizza team. You have small teams. You give them a mission. You give them a target set of customers. You give them a metric to hit. And then you let them go. And they run riot and they run roughshod through your org. They break the rules. They all of the procedures you have in place to make the company organized, they are constantly butting up against, they're constantly looking for the exception. It's an extremely difficult, often it feels chaotic, more chaotic often than it actually is. There is some method to the madness, knock on wood if you're doing it well. But it is a challenge. And I think that's the big challenge. And that's part of the cultural difficulty in making the transition, is it doesn't feel natural. It often doesn't feel good. It feels difficult. It feels chaotic. It feels crazy. And as I said, an MBA professor can describe to you why it's going to fail. And we are still in the early days of describing why it actually works, at least under the right circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And one follow-up question to this is, in the middle of the chaos, right, and trying to see through it, right, you need to define a vision for product. You need to align the organization in the sense of marketing and technology and support functions, right, to be able to deliver something in the end of the day. That for sure takes good amount of skills to be able to navigate all that, right? And to be able to, and something that I wanted to touch upon is exactly this ability, right? This ability to connect and to connect not only from an individual perspective, but also from a team perspective, right? Connecting with CMO, with CTO, and that's obviously each organization will have its own characteristic, right? But I think it will be interesting to hear if you have a perspective on how to do it properly, right? Because you have to have a lot of good skills to navigate all that, navigate the different biases, right, of the different disciplines as well. Is there a secret to doing that?
No, there's not a secret. The only way I have gotten at least comfortable with doing it is by doing it badly before I ever did it well. I spent a lot of my Google career, in all honesty, doing it badly, particularly with engineering. I didn't understand. One of the great lessons I learned at Google was I assumed, coming from a mostly consulting background after college, where I did do engineering, I assumed that great engineers were very structured, organized. Great software engineers in particular were very structured, organized personality types. And eventually I came to learn that great engineers, great software engineers, are by personality type more akin to artists. I would schedule meetings and they would never show up because checking the calendar, they were into the code and it didn't occur to them until 3 hours later to check their calendar. And so I think the key thing to take away in terms of navigating these relationships is to truly understand and value the functional depth and expertise that goes into being a great software engineer, being a great marketer, being a great operations or regulatory operations person, you name it. And building up a degree of belief and trust. And then on that basis of trust, pushing relentlessly as the voice of the customer, explaining, sometimes insisting that no matter what the functional prerogatives are, there are certain non-negotiables in what the customer expects that are required. I think one of the most insidious, again, it brings real value, but one of the most insidious terms in software-oriented technology development is minimum viable product, because a minimum viable product often gets translated. We drop the V and we talk about a minimum product or a minimum convenient for the org to deliver product. And that's often because it's easier from an eng perspective or from a go-to-market perspective or operationally or what have you. And so I think it's really important to understand the basis of functional expertise and excellence in order to have enough trust to advocate on behalf of the customer. Because you need to advocate on behalf of the customer. But it is challenging because the gravitational pull as a company gets successful and as a company gets large becomes increasingly internal. All startups are blessed with the fact that if they don't focus on the customer, they are dead tomorrow. And that's a great focusing mechanism. Successful companies can afford to start ignoring the customer, first in small ways and then gradually in increasingly large ways. That's the beauty of a franchise. And so the role of a chief product officer or of a product team in general is to have enough trust with the rest of the org to be able to insist on the customer's behalf.
Jag, can you tell us a little bit more about Nubank and your role there?
It feels like everybody knows Nubank at this point, but I think it's important to
describe a little bit.
It's fantastic to see a story about a Brazilian fintech that everyone is starting to know and that is viewed as a technology leader anywhere in the world. And I think that's quite a recent phenomenon. I first met David Velez, our co-founder and CEO, less than 3 years ago on Zoom. And if I'm being honest, the first time I met him, I knew almost nothing about Nubank. Hadn't really heard of it in my Silicon Valley bubble working at Facebook at the time. What Nubank is and what Nubank has become is essentially a bank, a financial services provider that is available in the palm of your hand in a mobile app. And instead of going to a branch, you can do everything in your mobile app. It is the largest fintech neobank by number of customers around the world. Company was founded in Sao Paulo, Brazil, operates across Brazil, and over the last 2 years or so, expanded across LATAM in Mexico and Colombia in particular. And since the company started as a credit card offering, and over the last 3 years or so, especially, we've expanded quite dramatically across financial services with a bank account, with insurance, with investments, with a small business account, with loans, and very recently expanding even into an e-commerce enabler where we have our own pretty nascent, very early days, just a couple of months in, but a nascent marketplace where our customers can shop. We have over 50 million customers. And so they have asked us, why can't Nubank not only save us from banking fees, which have been historically very high, but how about you get on our side and actually help us save money when we shop? And so we've launched a marketplace quite recently. And so in a nutshell, we are a Latin American focused banking and financial services company and app with over 50 million customers, over 55 million customers today, actually. We IPO'd both in Sao Paulo and in New York very recently in last December.
You mentioned, you were starting to say something around that, but I want to ask, why did you decide to go to Nubank? Because you were, in a great spot in the Silicon Valley, everything working fine and in great companies. What made you decide?
Yeah, as I said, I knew very little about Nubank when I first got introduced to David. There were a couple of reasons, some macro and some very particular to the company. The macro reason is I had spent at this point 15 years, just about 15 years, between Google and Quantcast and then Facebook with a ringside seat to the, unprecedented disruption of the media and advertising space globally. And that was an incredible intellectual challenge and journey. It had played itself out by 2020, and there were clear winners, and there were clear benefits that had brought in democratization of the media and advertising ecosystem. There were also some clear downsides that we're still wrestling with globally across the world as a society. It occurred to me, and this was largely triggered by my conversations with David, that a couple of things were true. One, that the next set of bits that were going to be disrupted were likely to be dollars and rupees and pesos and reais, and that we were just beginning, that what had happened in media and advertising over 20 years was going to happen in financial services over the next 20. The second thing became increasingly clear to me as I started talking to a few companies, Nubank included, was that some of the most interesting tech disruption stories were now happening not in Silicon Valley and not even in the United States. They were happening in places like Indonesia and India and Nigeria and Brazil and Mexico. And I had grown up, it depends on how you define the English-speaking Caribbean. I grew up in Trinidad and Tobago. And depending on how you define it, we will either define ourselves as Latin American or not. But loosely speaking, I'm from the region. And the opportunity to take the toolkits I had learned in Silicon Valley and in consulting before that and apply them not to the top richest billion people on the planet, which is basically where the media and advertising ecosystem operates, and apply it to the bottom half of the global income pyramid, and to do it in my own region, that was a mission that really resonated with me. And then I flew down to Sao Paulo one weekend to meet David and the rest of the team in person. And as I walked into the lobby, the first value of Nubank was literally there. And it was, we want our customers to love us, and this was the key word, fanatically. And that caught my attention. I spent the rest of my day interviewing, asking about that, hearing answers that I really loved. Remember, my consulting career started with the philosophy that said all great strategy came out of customers and how their needs were changing. I had then cultivated that toolkit in Silicon Valley for 15 years. And this was a company that felt more committed to that ideal than I had ever seen. It felt real. Mm-hmm. And the fact that it was happening thousands of miles from San Francisco, Silicon Valley, was an adventure that was simply too exciting to pass up.
Very cool. Very cool. And how is product at Nubank? Like, what is the discipline? Like, what are the capabilities that it has inside? Obviously, what you can share with us, but it will be interesting to hear more about it. Yeah,
I mean, there's a couple of ways to answer that. First off, one thing that is not entirely unique about Nubank, but I think we are following in a very particular direction, which, for example, is quite different than the way certainly Google and even Facebook operated at similar stages. We have been on a 3+ year journey, which has only accelerated since I started, to operate within the context of business units. And we define business units pretty broadly. Every business unit doesn't have to be consumer facing. Every business unit doesn't have to have a P&L, but we want big areas that create the core value of the company to operate cross-functionally, to operate with a general manager, a CEO, if you will, who is accountable and empowered to drive this cross-functional team to great outcomes. Often that GM has a product management background, but they come from any number of backgrounds, from engineering to business analysis to marketing, you name it. We have GMs from all our disciplines almost. And so that structure is very much in line with all the principles I've described of having a customer-centric cross-functional org. In parallel with that, we also have what we call chapters. This is a term borrowed from Spotify, but functions, or chapters as we call them, that are meant to drive excellence in the craft. And that includes product management, it includes design, it includes all of our core functions. And in terms of chapter excellence, I would say a couple of things. First off, as I mentioned earlier, product management as a job, as a function, barely existed 20 years ago. As an industry, whether it's Silicon Valley or anywhere in the world, we are still figuring it out what it really means, although we've made a lot of progress over the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years. But we still have a long way to go. That is true at Nubank. One of the ambitions we have at Nubank is to, we ask ourselves increasingly now, why couldn't the cutting edge of the product management discipline be defined out of a small, until recently little known company based in, of all places, Sao Paulo, Brazil, as well as Mexico City and Bogota and Buenos Aires. So we are still working on what excellence really means, but we're trying to distill it into a handful of principles. I'll share a couple just to give a sense of it. First off, know your customer. First of all, start with your customer. We've talked a lot about that already, but all customers are not the same. So what customer, when you say the customer, who are we talking about? Who specifically? Let's really understand our customer. And you can do that in any number of ways using any number of research techniques. Second principle that I would mention, just as another example, is understand the life stage of your product. And what do I mean by that? One of the greatest mistakes that companies make, that tech companies make, that I personally have made repeatedly, is scaling a product that's not ready to scale, scaling a product that hasn't reached what we call product market fit. The only thing you do when you take a small product pre-market fit and scale it, the only thing that happens is you take a small problem and you make a big mess. And so what we try to do is what we are trying to do, it's still very much a work in progress, is to get increasingly scientific about, is our product truly resonating with its intended customer? Do they love it? And if they don't love it, one of our core jobs is to tell everyone in the company, including, by the way, and this is the hardest part, the executive team and the CEO, this product is ready for prime time. It isn't ready to scale. Doesn't matter what metrics we set, doesn't matter what we put in the budget. We're not ready. And once you do hit product market fit, and you've done that in a rigorous and scientific and measurable way, then your job description becomes, how do I scale this thing like hell as fast as possible? And so the job description changes quite radically pre and post that point. It's almost like the boiling point for water. And so those are some of the principles that are not new. They're not like, we didn't invent them at Nubank. But while we talk about it in the discipline, actually operationalizing it and staying true to those principles is very, very difficult with the pressure of the hopes and dreams that you invest in a product, with the pressure of short-term results. It is always difficult to commit to, we are going to hit product market fit, we are going to get to customer love, because big successful companies can always make a product and can always fool themselves into thinking a product that's not ready is ready. And we try to be as disciplined as we can be, and we don't always succeed, but as disciplined as we can be to make sure we hit customer love before we get into the scaling phase of things.
No, I love that, and there's something. I mean, we can be, and you know that very well. Like, we can be very scientific, right, about all those things, including, like, you know, what is our habit metric? What is our acquisition metric? What is our, you know, we can go on and on. Our retention metric, and that obviously changes depending on the situation. Have you found a way to measure customer love for product? Is there a metric for that?
It would be a bit arrogant for me to say yes, but I'm going to say yeah, sort of. We use it Nubank, and look, these metrics I think will get better over time. We will iterate and find new metrics over time, but there are a handful of things that we look at in terms of customer love as for ourselves. Nubank is a company well before my time, although very consistent with what I believe, that focuses, as you know, Fabrizio, very much on the Net Promoter Score. We want our customers to tell other non-customers that this is a great application, this is a great service, this is a great product, this is a great value proposition. And we measure that using Net Promoter Score. In terms of a more product-centric version of a similar idea, we use something that's known as the Sean Ellis score, which I actually learned from product managers at Nubank when I first arrived in Sao Paulo, even though Sean Ellis is an actual person who lives
exactly
in Silicon Valley. I learned about it in Brazil. It, by the way, speaks to how well plugged in and connected the Brazil and the LATAM tech community is into these broader trends. And that is the closest thing I've seen. It's why I've loved it. We've adopted it at a much larger scale at Nubank in the last 2 years. It's a scientific way of measuring product market fit and a leading indicator of product market fit. And then the third metric, which is lagging, but is ultimately the metric you care about, is customer churn. Large companies with huge customer bases, whether they are Google or Facebook or even Nubank at this stage, we can cycle through a lot of our customers through a new product. And we can make that curve, that dashboard, look up and to the right for a long time. The key question is, are the customers who cycle through staying? Are they coming back month on month, week on week, even daily? And we look a lot at churn metrics. We look a lot at engagement metrics. What is the ratio of our daily active users to monthly active users? And we try not to fool ourselves that a product is really resonating, as opposed to we are putting it in front of lots of customers and almost forcing them to at least try it. We try very hard to obviously introduce our customers to new products that we have, but also to measure whether or not they are not just liking it, but using it, not just using it, but loving it. And those are the metrics we tend to use.
We are reaching the end of our session, so...
Already?
Yeah, already. But you have one more question still, Fabrizio.
Okay, two again.
Okay, two.
There's two things that I want to touch on. One is a follow-up of what you just said, Jag, on what's the balance in product leadership of the science and the art, right? Because as you know, like, you can get pretty scientific, right, with cohorts and these cohorts retain more, or are they're reaching our habit metric faster, so on and so forth, right? How much is too much, right, when it comes to becoming scientific in product leadership, and how much is qualitative?
You know what? I think the conceptual ideal is it gets as much as to be a science as you possibly can make it. The reality is, at minimum, we are not there yet. And so there are certain areas of product development, by the way, particularly as you get post-product market fit and you're in the scaling mode, as you're alluding to, Fabrizio, which you can make very, very scientific. Then there's the part that's a bit of the magic. How did it occur to David Velez that 2013, 2014 was the exact right moment where the Brazilian millennial middle class was ready for a new credit card offer, right? There's a bit of magic there. It is based on at least a kernel of science. I think the synthesis and the pulling it all together is a bit of strategic depth and magic. But Eric Schmidt used to say, when he was the CEO of Google many years ago, he would say, what is your core insight? Every time he was in a product review, I remember him asking that like a dozen times. What is the core insight? And that's not really science, but at least forces a logical articulation of who are you going after and what is it about your product that is going to seem 10x better, magical to them, that isn't out there today. And if you cannot articulate that, no matter how excited you are about, the kinds of consulting analysis that we tend to do, where you're like, the market is big and it's growing fast and it's, et cetera, et cetera. If you cannot articulate that, you're not ready yet. You're not there yet. And I think that still remains, it's becoming increasingly scientific, but I think it still remains largely a bit of an art and a little bit of based on experience and practice.
Very cool, very cool. And promise, last question. I really want to touch on this, which is people and talent, right? What do you look for when you're hiring product leaders, right? Or other capabilities, other people, right, with different knowledge to product teams. What are you looking for?
Yeah, I'll try to be concise, but I'll answer it the following way. Google was famous for hiring only engineers, people with engineering backgrounds, to be product managers. Now, I was lucky in the sense that I had an engineering background, which I hadn't used for a decade. I had an engineering education. I had never been a software engineer. I had never put a line of code into production. And I'd been in consulting, but I at least could say I had an engineering degree. That's what allowed me to become a PM at Google. Otherwise, I would have been vetoed. A couple of months after I became a PM at Google, the bar was raised even further, where you had to have not just an engineering degree, but a computer science degree. So I was one of the last probably dozen people who were allowed to be a PM at Google without a computer science degree. There were great people, Kevin Systrom from Instagram, who couldn't pass that bar, who didn't become PMs at Google. He did okay in the end. And so there are still, I think a legacy of believing that understanding technology is the core skill set. And I think understanding technology is important. I think even more important is the ability to work with people, including engineers, and that sort of customer empathy and just empathy for people you're working with is really, really important. I think it's actually more important than understanding technology deeply per se. Although the ideal, I would say, is having a skill set and an affinity for understanding customers really deeply, for being able to work with people who think in a very technology-driven way. And the third thing I would say is we are not in the spaghetti against the wall business. There is a discipline to trying to understand, what is that core insight? Where is that magic where a specific set of customers will truly love the product? And that requires an ability to think in a very structured, organized, logical way. Those are the three sort of toolkits that I tend to look for. Almost nobody, at least to start, has all three of those things. And if you forced me to choose, I would choose the customer empathy gene first.
Fantastic.
Great. Thank you very much, Jag. So our time is up. Fabricio, would you like to add anything else?
No, just thanks, Jag, again for your generosity of your time to be with us. We think it's a very important topic that we need to put some light on, and having people like yourself here is fantastic. Thank you again.
And maybe we schedule another podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed it. Bye. Bye, both of you. Cheers.
So thank you very much, Fabricio and Jag, for everything today. And the Customer-centric Growth series will be published as a McKinsey Talks video and podcast on YouTube and Spotify, but also as short articles on mckinsey.com.br. If you would like to know more about product-led organizations, send an email to mckinseytalks@mckinsey.com. I would also like to thank all of you who are watching us on video or listening to us on podcast. Go to mckinseytalks.com for a full agenda of McKinsey Talks. There you can also check out this episode and earlier ones on video or podcast. That's it. Thank you very much and see you next time.